Welcome back. In a few days, we will celebrate our nation's 243rd birthday. There will be lots of 4th of July fireworks, cookouts, and other special get-togethers. There will also be a recounting of significant events in our nation's founding, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the shot heard around the world, and the surrender at Yorktown. Even with all that, there are many parts of the story we often don't hear about, and they're just as much a part of our nation's history. We should point that out. Joining us to talk about that for a few minutes is UC history professor Judy Spraul-Schmidt. I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I think the way I'd like to start this interview, we celebrate the 4th of July, and it's a lot of fanfare, sometimes without a lot of subtext. And when you look at the Revolutionary War and how we came to be a country, a lot gets lost in translation. Can you give us a little perspective on just the seriousness and the length of the Revolutionary War?
Well, of course, but I would go back a little bit farther in time and say, how did we get to that? And you had 13 colonies who operated under British rule and were very proud to be part of the British Empire, but things started to change from the perspectives of these colonists in America after the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. That became a marker for change after 1763 for a couple of reasons. One is the British deciding that they would be a little more they would intervene a little more in governance in these colonies that had mostly operated on their own but under British rule. And one of the things they did that's particularly important for people in this area is set up what they called a proclamation line, a line from which they said colonists would not move any farther west, would not interfere with the native populations, and that was particularly shocking to people whose every intention was to move west, and the whole reason for winning the French and Indian War was to have that land that the French were also claiming, and of course a whole series of separate tribes. So that seems different from the perspective of the colonists.
Sure.
And a couple of other things.
When we talk about the Revolutionary War and you talk about the Founding Fathers, what were some of the sacrifices of the Founding Fathers? Well,
the sacrifices of the Founding Fathers were serious. They were gone from their homes for great distances of times. The reason we have such a great record of letters between John Adams and his wife Abigail is that he was gone so much of the time that they explained their issues. And also, we have to remember that it was 1774 before there was a joint meeting of all of the colonies talking about what they should do with relations with England, which they saw as having changed in a way that violated their rights as citizens of the British Empire. And they began to meet there. George Washington wrote to some of his colleagues about what this conference would be like and what direction are we headed in, and will we have to take some action and change our place within the empire. That's 74, and then they meet that, and that's what we call the First Continental Congress. Then
Sure.
They say, well, we'll meet again next year.
They were the original rebels.
Well, but they weren't the only ones. Even before that, you saw particularly in New England and around Boston, the people who called themselves Sons of Liberty and were ready to take action as early as 1770, but 1774 was a turning point. And then, as I bet you know this, but the First Continental Congress members said, we will meet again next May of 1775, and see where we are. And by the time they met in May of 1775, there had already been conflict in Boston.
Yeah. When we talk about the Revolution, it wasn't just a Revolutionary War. It was a civil war too. Would you mind explaining that?
Well, and it was a civil war to the extent that there were strong differences of perspective among the colonists over whether or not we should continue to be loyal to the British Empire, or whether we should fight with the British government over the way that things were operated, or whether it was time to leave. 'Tis time to part, is what Thomas Paine ended up saying later. But I lost my train.
That's okay. What role did newspapers play in
Oh,
the whole
newspapers!
process?
Newspapers played a very important role, and they were because they carried information from one place to another, especially from city to city. And in cities, you had people gathering in the taverns, in the town squares, because they didn't all have their own copy of the newspaper. They were sharing it and they were discussing it. So that carried information from one place to the other. And you know that during the course of the war, there were heavier concentrations of loyalists, people loyal to England, in some places than others. Much of New York stayed loyal through much of the war, and in fact, New York was under British control for much of the war. But there were always surprises. The British were sure that there were so many loyalists that that would make it easier for them to put down this rebellion. And in places like Western North Carolina, where there had already been conflict between the people closer to the ocean and in the backcountry.
The Declaration of Independence, one of our most profound documents, but it borrowed from other documents.
Of course it did.
We have about a minute left. Can you tell us how?
Well, it borrowed from Enlightenment ideas and from British rule, from the British Empire, and the argument all the way through the Declaration of Independence is that the British government was denying, and especially the King, was denying these colonists their rights as Englishmen and as citizens of their individual colonies.
Want to thank you for being here. What parting thought would you like to leave our audience with as they celebrate the 4th of July?
The parting thought for me is that this was a war for liberty, although defined differently by different people. There was a great movement among slaves and people who thought that slavery was inconsistent with the goals of the revolution. Women, people who didn't have any property or standing, were all sure that it was their war, and in many cases they fought to fulfill that.
All right, Judy, thank you.
Thank you
for sharing your perspective.